I want to tell you why I'm here. It actually all started with a song. Now, for those of you that know me, I am not a music guy. In fact, I may be the only person you've ever met that's never owned any music. I've never bought a record, an album, a CD, nothing. You see, music just doesn't do it for me. Sorry, Larry. You know. Your music does. Yeah. But about 9 years ago, Terry Bach sang a song on this stage that really touched me. Now, after hearing the song, I immediately started to think of the story of David and Bathsheba, and a lesson started to form in my mind for the middle school youth group. So when I got home, I started writing the lesson, and the words actually came pretty easily. You see, David is my favorite person in the Bible, and I know his life really well. I also know the devastating impact that his relationship with Bathsheba had on his life, but even more importantly, had on his family's life. So, when the lesson was done, I'd written it, I looked it over, and it was good. And I thought to myself, I can't wait to teach the kids. But in the back of my mind, I thought, this lesson is really for the men. Now, I quickly pushed that scary thought out of my head because I was a youth group teacher. I was a Sunday school teacher. I didn't know enough about the Bible to teach adults. Now, a few weeks later, I actually got a chance to teach the kids, and the lesson went pretty well. So I got home, I filed that lesson away, and that was it. Or so I thought. So a couple of months later, my men's Bible study teacher, Mark DeQuattro, he told me that he was going to be away on an upcoming Saturday. And he asked if I could lead the Saturday morning men's Bible study. Now, without hesitation, I said no. Right? Right? Remember that. Yeah. So, and I quickly came up with an excuse that I was just too busy at work. But, in the back of my mind, I knew I was a Sunday school teacher or a youth group teacher. I'm not a teacher of adults. Now, that thought really scared me. So I had to push it way out. Now, a couple of months later, we are getting ready to come to church. And I come downstairs, and we're all getting ready. And Sandy, my wife, puts a CD on. And that song comes on. That song really touched me. So I quickly got everyone ready, and we rushed out of the house and got to church. Now, later that evening, the phone rang. And it was Mark. So I braced for his question, but I was ready with my answer. But you know what? He threw me a curveball. He didn't ask me if I could fill in for him on a Saturday. Instead, he said, Joe, has God placed a message on your heart that you'd like to share with the men? His question pierced me like a sword. And I thought to myself, how does he know? So I recovered, and I quickly said to him, I have a question for you first. And he said, all right. And I said, did my wife Sandy call you and tell you to call me? Right? And he said, no, what are you talking about? And I said, all right, then I will do it. I do have a message that I'd like to share for the men. So about a month later, I did the David and Bathsheba message for the men's group, and it actually went pretty well. And when it was over, I was relieved. Or so I thought. So as I drove home from the church, I was thinking about the message, and in the back of my mind, the thought came into my head, this lesson is really for the church. Now that thought scared me even more. So I buried it. But you know what? It just kept coming back and more frequently. So as you can see, it took me probably about 9 years to be obedient, but I am here today. Now before I start, I would like you to hear the song that brought me here today. The song is called Generations, and it's sung by Sarah Groves. Now, the line in this song that really got me was, remind me of this with every decision. Generations will reap what I sow. I can pass on a curse or a blessing to those that I'll never know. And what scared me even more was I going to pass on a curse or a blessing to those I know really well? Now, in case I start crying at any point, I will blame Ernie. I've been hanging around with him a lot lately. So, so many times, I don't think about the long-term impact of some of my decisions. And sometimes I care more about what I want now. And I think, you know what? Whatever happens later, I can deal with that. I don't always realize all of the consequences of my decisions. I heard a quote once about sin that I really thought was true. It says, sin will take you farther than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you want to pay. That quote is so true, and it applies so well to the story of David and Bathsheba. All right, now, for those of you that may not know all the details of David's life, I'm going to give you a quick introduction. Some of them they should be in your notes. All right, so David was the youngest of 8 brothers and was the runt of the litter. He was a lowly shepherd who learned to protect the sheep from lions and bears. Now, despite his lack of size and his questionable chosen profession, God chose David as the future king of Israel. Many of you probably know, it's one of the few things I knew about David before we started reading the Bible, was that David killed the giant Goliath. And he did it with a slingshot, while the rest of the men in the army were too afraid to fight. Because of his success in battle against Goliath, he became part of King Saul's household. And he had other fantastic successes against Israel's enemies. In fact, he had so much success that King Saul became jealous of David and hunted him down for 8 years to kill him. Later, King Saul actually dies in battle, and David becomes the king of Israel. And he leads the country to great success against Israel's enemies. And this, to me, is the most amazing part. That in the Bible, God actually refers to David as a man after my own heart. And he promises David that one of your descendants will lead Israel forever. All right, so we're going to fast forward a little bit. David has now been the king for 20 years. And he has everything he ever wanted. He has wealth, respect, success, and many wives. He was on top of the world, or so he thought. So we're going to take a look at the story. We're going to be reading today in 2 Samuel, chapter 11. So you can follow along in your Bibles or in the notes, and it might even be up there. Okay, so starting in verse 1. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. Now, I should have said this up front. Because I sort of associate myself with a teacher of children, I like to tell stories. So that's what the format is going to be. We're going to read this story. I'm going to comment on it. So I hope you like that. All right, so first of all, David is the king of Israel. And one of his number one responsibilities is being their commander-in-chief and leading them in battle. But this year, David didn't lead the Israelites in battle like he had for the past 20 years. I always wondered, why didn't David lead them? And as I read, I started to think, I think he was just bored. They had just completed some of their greatest successes in battle. And I think David was just restless. So instead, he decides, I think it's a good idea that let the other army guys go out and Joab will lead them. I'll just stay home with the women and the children and the servants. So you know what? He was where he shouldn't be. And one night, he couldn't sleep. So I have a couple questions for you. Have you ever been where you shouldn't be? Maybe late at night, surfing the internet? Maybe when no one's around, flipping through the different HBO channels? Maybe reconnecting with an old friend on Facebook? Now, as David walked around on that roof, he saw this beautiful woman bathing on a lower roof. Now, I have to tell you, whenever I've read this, what comes to mind is this. I see David walking around, he sees her, and he immediately ducks down. Because he doesn't want to be seen, because he knows if she sees him, she's going to cover up or go in the house. So he knew instinctively he shouldn't be watching her. But you know what? He couldn't turn away. David lingered when he should have fled. And you know, the more he thought about her, his desire for her grew stronger and stronger. Isn't it true that sin usually starts in our mind? So we're going to continue with the story in verse 3. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, "I am pregnant." You see, David was facing a major temptation that night on the roof. He obviously was very attracted to Bathsheba. But you know what? He could have gone back into the palace to visit one of his many wives or concubines to legitimately meet his needs. Instead, he wanted what wasn't his. He wanted Bathsheba. Now, I believe David truly didn't know who she was when he asked the guards. But, you know, this is the way I sort of see it going down. The guards knew exactly what he was thinking. And so when he asked them, I think the guard said, "Oh, David, that's Bathsheba. You know Bathsheba. She's the daughter of Eliam." David, I think you know Eliam a little bit. He's the head of your royal bodyguard. And she's also, David, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. You've met him, right? He's one of your 30 mighty men. Probably your most loyal guy, David. Oh, and I think right now he's out on the battlefield fighting for you, David. That's the Uriah, in case you didn't know. But you know, I also see David saying, "Whoa, guys, what are you talking about? I just want to talk to her. She just looks so interesting." Right? David ignored some major warning lights on that roof. And instead of fleeing from temptation, he charged right toward it. So Bathsheba comes to the palace. David sleeps with her, and he sends her home. And that night, I picture David maybe laying in his bed, and he goes, "You know what? It is good to be the king. I got exactly what I wanted, and no one will ever know." Or so he thought. Because Bathsheba sends word to David, "I am pregnant." Now, David was the king. David was the man. He was a great problem solver. He could fix things. This isn't a problem for David. So I'm sure he just thought to himself, "I got this. I'm going to fix it. I just need to come up with a really good plan." You know, so many times in our lives, when we've made a mistake, our first instinct is to cover it up. And only sometimes when we look back, we say, "You know what? I wish I would have admitted my mistake and asked for forgiveness at that time," because the consequences often get multiplied significantly in the future. I've titled this message, "Small Decisions, Big Consequences." You know, when we sin, we often attempt to cover it up, and we make many other bad decisions. And each of those bad choices leads us further down a path that we thought we'd never take. And it usually does multiply the consequences significantly. So we're going to look at verse 6 to see how David handled this. So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent with him. So essentially, David brings Uriah home under the false pretense that he wanted a battle update. You know, I picture David meeting Uriah and saying, "Uriah, so good to see you. I missed you. How are the guys doing? I wish I was there with you." You know, and after a little bit of small talk, he says, Uriah, you must be so tired, from the battle and your long trip. Why don't you go home, maybe take a shower? I've sent some food down so you and your wife can enjoy a nice dinner. And then maybe you just guys relax for the evening, if you know what I mean, right? So obviously, David wants Uriah to go home. He wants him to sleep with his wife so that everyone would think that Uriah got her pregnant. Honestly, David's plan was brilliant, and all his problems were about to be solved. Or so we thought. We're going to continue in verse 9. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and didn't go down to his house. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. You see, David's perfect plan wasn't so perfect. Whenever I read this story, I picture David charging down the stairs, right, in the morning, so excited. His problems are about to be over. And then he's told Uriah didn't go home. He slept on the stairs. And I picture David going to him saying, what's wrong with you? Why didn't you go? And Uriah basically says, hey, David, how could I go home to the comfort of my own home and sleep with my wife when David, your men are on a battlefield? David, I can't do that. But remember, David is still the king. David is the man. He's a problem solver. Now, he hadn't counted on Uriah's integrity, so he was just going to need a better plan. He could have still confessed and asked for forgiveness, but David had everything under control. Or so he thought. So let's look at verse 12. Then David said to him, stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants and did not go home. Now, most of you guys know I'm a Yankee fan, a baseball fan. So when I read that, the first thing that came to mind is swing and a miss, strike two for David. Right? Again, he thought he had the perfect plan. He's going to serve the best food and the best wine. And Uriah's glass was never going to be empty. I'm sure every time Uriah turned one way, the bottle was poured the other way. And you know what? He did. He got him really drunk. But even drunk, Uriah wouldn't go home. At this point, David knew there is nothing that I can do that is going to get Uriah to violate his principles. And that must have been like a knife in David's heart, because that was the type of man David used to be. Ernie, when you mentioned about integrity, and it's what we do when no one's watching. It's easy to look good when everyone's there. What do you do when no one's watching? What did David do on the roof when no one was watching? So David needs a new plan. Let's see what he comes up with. I'm going to go to verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he'll be struck down and die. So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Now, continuing in verse 26, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. So essentially, David signs Uriah's death warrant. And to make it worse, he makes Uriah carry the letter himself and deliver it to Joab. Now, one thing David knew for sure, I can trust this man's integrity. I can give him a letter that's not addressed to him. There's no way he's going to open it. And he didn't. And he brings it to Joab, and Joab reads it, and he puts Uriah on the front line where the fighting is fiercest. And David is about to have his plan come to fruition, right? So Uriah is out there, he's dead. But not only Uriah dies. It says that some other men died unnecessarily in battle to cover up David's sins. Now, after plan A and plan B fail, David went with the unimaginable plan C. And his final deception was when he actually married Bathsheba to cover up his sin. You know, David was a smart guy, and I'm sure he thought this out and said, hey, if I don't do this cover-up, I'm going to lose a lot. And he figured out, I'm going to lose, I could lose my life for what I've done. I can lose the loyalty of all of my men, the respect of my people. But the one thing David didn't count was on God's consequences for his sin. You know, on the palace roof that night, the thing that always struck me when I've read this, David didn't set out to be an adulterer or a murderer. He was just taking a walk. But you know what? Each small, bad decision took him further along that path. You see, sin will take us farther than we want to go, keep us longer than we want to stay, and cost us more than we want to pay. I'm going to ask you guys if you'd repeat that with me. Ready? Sin will take us farther than we want to go, keep us longer than we want to stay, and cost us more than we want to pay. Now, when this was over, I'm sure David thought to himself, whew, I just dodged a major arrow here. It's over. Bathsheba is my wife, and no one will ever know what I did. Or so he thought. Right? So, and you know, I'm sure the people of Israel, many of them thought he was a hero because he took in this poor wife of one of his fallen heroes, this poor widow. And I'm sure that people actually said, what a great king we have. See how he supports his men when they die in battle. He takes care of their family. But you know what? David knew the truth. And David didn't feel like a hero. Now, many of you probably know that David also wrote many of the Psalms in the Bible. And he wrote Psalm 32, verses 3 and 4, and he did this right after the Bathsheba incident. And he says, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was sapped as in the summer heat. You see, David felt tremendous guilt, but he still refused to confess his sins and ask for God's forgiveness. So since David wouldn't listen to the conviction of God or to his own conscience, God decided to send someone else to talk to David. So he sent the prophet Nathan, who is a trusted advisor and friend to David. Now, I can only imagine how Nathan felt when he got that assignment. I think the conversation went a little bit like this. Wait, what? God, whoa. Let me get this straight. You want me to confront the king about the sins he committed and then cover it up by killing one of his other trusted friends. That's your plan, really? And God said, yeah, I need you to go talk to David. So Nathan knew, hey, I'm going to need God's wisdom and I'm going to need courage to do this because I just can't go right at him if I want to keep living. So we're going to look at what Nathan did, inspired by the Spirit of God. And we're going to continue now to the book of 2 Samuel, and we're going to start in chapter 1, in verse 1. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were two men in a certain town, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity." See, I believe Nathan chose this story because he knew David was a shepherd and he cared and loved for those little sheep. And he knew that the story of that little pet lamb would touch David's hardened heart. And it did. You know, David assumed the story was true. As a king, people would come to them with their grievances. So he assumed this was a true story. And after he heard it, he immediately pronounced the death sentence on the man who stole that lamb. Interesting, though, in Israel, there was no capital punishment for theft. All right, so we're going to continue in verse 7. Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, David. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And David, if this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own." So Nathan confronts David and he tells him, "You're the man, David." Now I know in our culture, when someone says to you, "You're the man," that's a good thing. This was not a good thing. You are the man in that story, David. You stole Uriah's wife. You had him killed. And then he reminded David, God gave you everything, David. Everything, David, he gave to you. And you know what, David? If you had needed more, if you would have wanted more, all you had to do was ask, and he would have given it to you. See, David's about to find out what God's consequences are for his sin. So we're going to continue in verse 10. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, David, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. What David did in secret is now going to be done to him in broad daylight. Continue on to verse 13. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. So Nathan tells him, David, you killed Uriah. You brought violence into his life and into his family. And guess what, David? Your family will know violence. You will experience violence the rest of your life. And David, guess what? Not just you, but your family. And David, you did this. You brought this on yourself. You brought this on your family, David. David's hard heart finally broke, and he admitted that he had sinned. And first, he had sinned against God. And you know what? David was a man of God, and he knew God's laws. And the punishment back then for murder and adultery was death. So David was waiting for his sentence to be pronounced, just like he pronounced the death sentence on the man who stole the lamb. But you know what? Our God is a merciful God. Let's say that again. Our God is a merciful God. He saw that David was truly repentant, and he forgave him, and he spared him his life, and he forgave him for his sins. But you know what? God did not spare him from the natural consequences of his actions. God let the full weight of the consequences, his natural consequences in life, fall on David and his family. And throughout the rest of David's life, his family and he paid for those sins many, many times over. You know, it's amazing to me that this all started on a roof with a lustful look. Because you see, sin will take you farther than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you way, way, way more than you want to pay. So let's take a quick look at what are some of the things, some of the costs for David as a result of his adultery with Bathsheba. First, there was an unwanted pregnancy, which led to the murder of a trusted friend. Then, the death of David's baby son with Bathsheba. Not long after that, David's only daughter was raped by David's oldest son, her stepbrother. Two of David's sons eventually are murdered. And then a civil war is led by David's beloved son, Absalom, who temporarily unseats him as the king of Israel. And then during that civil war, Absalom is also killed. So do you remember when David, pronounced his sentence on the man with the lamb? He said, "The man who stole this lamb must pay 4 times over." Well, David pays for the death of Uriah the Hittite with the lives of 4 of his sons. Do you think David thought it was worth it? This story, every time I read it and think about it, it's a good reminder for me anytime I'm about to violate one of God's laws. It makes me think, what will this really cost me? Could it cost me my wife? Could it cost me my sons? Could it cost me my future grandchildren? My job? My reputation? Is it worth it? If David could hit the rewind button on his life and be back on the roof that night, I bet he would have turned away from Bathsheba and gone back to bed. Remind me of this with every decision. Generations will reap what I sow. I can pass on a curse or a blessing to those that I'll never know, and maybe even worse, to those I know really well. The first time I read this, I just tossed this story aside. And I know it's very easy for us to do the same. Because my first reaction was, I would never do what David did. But let me ask you a question. What are your temptations? What are the things that lead you away from God? Here's an even worse one. What are your small indiscretions? Maybe it's not adultery or murder, but could it be pride, anger, lust, unforgiveness, arrogance, or any other sin that draws us in? Remember, if this could happen to David, a man described by God as a man after my own heart, then you know what? We too can fall into temptation. And we can do things that we thought we'd never, ever do. Now, I'd like to leave you with 3 things. First, when you were tempted, and know this, everyone is tempted by something. Rich, what tempts you may be nothing to me. I could walk by it 1,000 times and never turn my head. But what tempts me isn't so easy for me. So we are all tempted by something. And my advice on this is when you're tempted, run away. Don't see how close you can get to the flame without getting burned. I can tell you this, that flame has destroyed many lives, many families, and many reputations. Second, sin will take you farther than you want to go, cost you more, or keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you way more than you want to pay. And then lastly, if you're here today and you've crossed that line, stop covering it up and go to God and ask for forgiveness. Guess what? He already knows what you've done. To me, the amazing part of the story of David and Bathsheba is that God actually forgave him when David came to him and admitted his sin. And you know what? If we go to him, he'll forgive us too. Remember, God sent his only son, Jesus Christ, to die on a cross for us, to pay for the penalty of all of our sins. He forgave David for adultery and murder. He will certainly forgive us for our sins if we come to him and ask for forgiveness. Now, I'd like to close with some prayer. If everyone would just bow their heads with me. God, help us to truly count the cost before we act, and give us the strength to flee from temptation. Lord, you are a God that has blessed us immensely and given us everything. So when we feel in need of love, money, affection, acceptance, or anything else, help us to not try to fulfill these legitimate needs in illegitimate ways. Instead, Lord, remind us to come to you as our Father in heaven, because you are a God that will meet our needs. Amen.